Malcolm Ellis, a successful black surgeon and CEO, confronts systemic racism and police corruption when he becomes involved in a high-profile case of police brutality in Elmsford. Despite his accomplishments, he is repeatedly underestimated and belittled by white authority figures, including Officer Daniels, who sees him as a threat. Malcolm faces constant microaggressions and overt prejudice, both from law enforcement and the public, who dismiss his efforts as tokenism. The tension escalates into a public showdown, forcing Malcolm to navigate a corrupt system that refuses to acknowledge his worth or the validity of his fight for justice. The air in the small diner was thick with the scent of sizzling bacon and fresh coffee. The soft hum of conversation mixed with the clinking of silverware against plates, creating the kind of soothing noise that filled the space with an easy familiarity. For a moment, nothing about the scene felt out of place. Until you saw the man in the corner booth, Dr. Malcolm Ellis, renowned neurosurgeon and the CEO of a prestigious medical institute, sat in the most unassuming corner of the diner, wearing nothing more than a well-worn jacket and a pair of dark jeans. A small black leather briefcase rested on the seat next to him, but it wasn't the shiny gold watch or expensive cufflinks that caught people's attention. It was the humility that seemed to radiate from him like a quiet force. No one at the diner seemed to recognize him, and that was exactly how Malcolm liked it. The woman at the counter, a middle-aged waitress with a name tag that read Linda, waved him over with a friendly smile. She had been serving him for months, never once asking about his past, his career, or how he had come to sit alone in a diner full of regulars. It was a rhythm they had come to know well. "Your usual, Dr. Ellis?" she asked, already pulling a coffee mug down from the rack and setting it on the counter. She made no move to confirm his identity, but spoke with the casual confidence of someone who understood that this was just another morning routine. Malcolm smiled, a soft curl of his lips that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Yeah, you know me too well." Linda laughed, a genuine chuckle that carried across the room. "I just know you like to keep things simple, Dr. Ellis. Black coffee, 2 sugars, right?" "That's right," Malcolm replied, folding the newspaper he had been reading and setting it aside. His eyes lingered on the headline about another round of protests, but he quickly pushed the thought aside. For once, his mind wasn't on the chaos of the world outside. His phone buzzed in his pocket, but he ignored it. It wasn't an important call. The real work, the one that mattered, had already been done. He had already earned his place in the world, or so he liked to think. Malcolm had made a name for himself in the surgical theater, his hands performing miracles that most would deem impossible. His reputation as a healer, as a man who could save lives in the most literal sense, had opened doors. He had a sprawling office in a skyscraper, a penthouse with views of the city skyline, and more money than he cared to count. But none of that had ever been his driving force. He didn't need the acclaim, the awards, or the power. He had come from nothing, raised in a small apartment on the edge of a working-class neighborhood, with a mother who worked 2 jobs just to keep the lights on. His father had never been in the picture, and Malcolm had learned early on to rely on his own strength to navigate the world. Still, it wasn't the wealth or prestige that defined him. It was the way he walked through life unnoticed by most, blending into the background like a shadow, only to emerge when he was needed. The kind of man who didn't flaunt his success, but instead made sure to remember where he came from. As he sat in the corner booth of the diner, he didn't feel like a famous surgeon or a CEO. He felt like a man who just wanted a cup of coffee in peace. The people around him, the truck drivers, the college students, the mothers and fathers, had no idea who he was, and that was the way he liked it. "Everything okay, Dr. Ellis?" Linda asked, her eyes catching the faintest glimpse of worry as she approached with his coffee. She had seen enough to know that the doctor was a man of few words, but there were times when even his silence felt heavy. Malcolm gave her a small nod. "Just fine, Linda, just fine." Linda didn't press further, though there was a flicker of curiosity in her eyes. People like Dr. Ellis, men of his stature, didn't often make time for a diner like this. It was too small, too out of the way for someone as important as him. But she never said anything. She had learned long ago that everyone had their reasons for being somewhere. And if Dr. Ellis was there, sitting in a booth with a worn leather jacket, well, it wasn't her place to ask why. Malcolm stirred his coffee absent-mindedly, his thoughts wandering to the task that awaited him later in the day. Another round of board meetings, more patients to assess, more decisions to be made. The weight of responsibility hung heavy on his shoulders, but he had learned to wear it well. His position in the world demanded it. But there was one thing Malcolm could never escape, no matter how much money he made or how many surgeries he performed. He couldn't escape the fact that people still looked at him differently because of the color of his skin. It was something he had learned to live with, though it often meant having to fight twice as hard to earn half the respect. It wasn't always overt. Rarely was it. The looks were subtle, the glances quickly averted when he caught them. The hushed conversations that stopped as soon as he entered the room. Malcolm had long since grown accustomed to the quiet discomfort that followed him. The way some people would smile at him, as if they were doing him a favor by acknowledging his presence. He had made peace with it, in a way. But today, something felt different. The old familiar itch at the back of his neck wasn't just a passing feeling. It was the reminder of a larger truth that haunted him. Even here, in this diner, he couldn't escape it. A man in a suit slid into the booth across from him, breaking his thoughts. His eyes were sharp, calculating, and the briefcase he carried seemed far too large for someone who didn't hold a similar level of importance. "Dr. Ellis, I presume?" the man asked, his voice smooth, but carrying the faintest hint of condescension. "I've heard a lot about you." Malcolm didn't respond immediately, his eyes narrowing as he looked over the man. The stranger's smile was tight, his handshake firm, but with an edge. Everything about him screamed of a man accustomed to power. "I don't usually entertain unsolicited meetings," Malcolm said after a pause, his voice steady, though his posture had subtly shifted. The man's smile faltered slightly, but he quickly recovered. "It's not unsolicited, Dr. Ellis. I represent a group that has interest in your work. In fact, they'd like to offer you something that could change everything for you." Malcolm didn't need to ask for specifics. He had been in this position before, surrounded by people who had more ambition than sense, who saw his success as an opportunity to use him for their own gain. He had grown adept at identifying these types. "I'm not interested in anything that involves compromise," he said, his voice now tinged with a firmness that would brook no argument. The man's eyes flickered with irritation, but he masked it quickly. "No compromise, Dr. Ellis, but think of what you could do with the resources we could provide. A man like you, with your influence, could change the entire medical field. The community, hell, the country could be your next step." Malcolm leaned back in his seat, his fingers resting lightly on his coffee cup. The way the man spoke, so sure of himself, irritated Malcolm more than he cared to admit. "I've changed enough," he said quietly, meeting the man's eyes. "I've already made my mark, and I don't need anyone's help to do what I do." The stranger's smile was cold now, but he didn't argue. He simply stood, leaving behind a business card on the table, before walking out of the diner, leaving Malcolm with only the lingering scent of his cologne and the taste of bitter coffee. Malcolm sat for a long moment, staring at the card. "Another offer I'll never take," he thought to himself, before pushing the card aside and finishing his coffee. There were more important things to focus on: his work, his patients, and the quiet ripple of societal expectations that he would never escape. But in moments like this, when he was alone in a small diner, he could almost forget. And for that, he was grateful. The sound of the diner door chimed as it opened again, drawing Malcolm's attention from the cooling coffee in front of him. A man in his late 40s, dressed in a tan suit that was too tight at the shoulders, entered with an air of self-importance. The man's eyes scanned the room quickly, landing on Malcolm for a brief moment before sliding away. As he approached the counter, Malcolm noticed the faint flicker of recognition in his eyes, but it wasn't the kind of recognition one might expect when seeing a well-known figure. It was more like the recognition of someone trying to place a name they couldn't quite recall. Linda, the waitress, greeted the man with a smile, one that was wider than usual. "Good morning, Mr. Willoughby. Can I get you the usual?" Mr. Willoughby waved his hand dismissively. "Just coffee for now, Linda. I've got a busy day ahead." He took a seat at the counter, his back stiff, as though he were still in the middle of a boardroom presentation. Malcolm had no idea who this man was, but there was something about him that triggered a sense of wariness. It wasn't just the way he carried himself. There was an undercurrent of superiority in the way he looked around the diner, the way his gaze lingered too long on Malcolm, as if trying to assess whether or not he belonged in such a place. Malcolm returned to his thoughts, trying to tune out the hum of conversation. But it wasn't long before he felt the prickling sensation again. The sensation of being watched, of being judged in a space that wasn't meant for him. A few minutes passed before Mr. Willoughby's voice rose above the clink of cutlery. "Linda? Is that man still sitting in the corner there?" Linda glanced over her shoulder, then back to him. "Oh, him. He's a regular Dr. Ellis, you know, the neurosurgeon." "Ah," Mr. Willoughby said, with a slight dismissive tilt of his head. Looks more like a..." The rest of his sentence was lost, swallowed by the sizzle of bacon from the grill and the soft clinking of silverware. But Malcolm didn't need to hear the rest. He had lived long enough to know when someone was talking about him. The way the sentence had trailed off, the way Mr. Willoughby's tone had shifted, made Malcolm's stomach tighten. He was used to being underestimated, to being overlooked in favor of assumptions. But in moments like this, it was hard not to feel the weight of it all. Malcolm took a slow sip of his coffee, his eyes fixed on the swirling dark liquid as he processed what had just happened. He could feel the sharp sting of the microaggression, the subtle but powerful dismissal of his presence. He could feel Mr. Willoughby's eyes on him now, sizing him up in ways that Malcolm had seen too many times before. The man was trying to place Malcolm's position in the social hierarchy, trying to decide whether he was worthy of the same space, the same respect, as anyone else in the room. The frustration bubbled up within Malcolm, but he forced it down. The last thing he needed was to create a scene. He wasn't like those other men, those other black men who had been forced to raise their voices to be heard. No, he had learned long ago that his silence was his strength. He could feel Mr. Willoughby's gaze still on him, but he refused to acknowledge it. He turned his attention back to the window, watching as the rain drizzled down in thin sheets, blurring the outline of the world beyond the diner. For a brief moment, he thought about the story he had read earlier, about the protests in the city, another round of calls for justice, for change. It was so easy to get caught up in the rhetoric, in the noise. But Malcolm had always been more of an action-oriented man. He wanted to make the difference, not just talk about it. But right now, it felt like the world was turning on him, waiting for him to prove himself, waiting for him to show them that he belonged, even though he had more than earned his place. The internal battle raged, the anger at the subtle prejudice, the frustration with being forced to carry the weight of these assumptions everywhere he went. He just wanted to be left alone, to not have to fight against these invisible barriers every single day. A few more moments passed in the diner, each second stretching out as the tension built like a slow burn. Malcolm could feel it. The subtle glances, the way Linda shifted in place when she handed Mr. Willoughby his coffee, the way she made sure to speak louder, more confidently, as if to assure him that he wasn't being served by someone less than him. The final straw came when Mr. Willoughby stood up, smoothing the front of his jacket as he made his way toward the door. As he passed Malcolm's table, he paused just long enough to offer a quick, sharp glance, one that lingered a moment too long. "Have a good day, Dr. Ellis," Mr. Willoughby said, his voice oozing with an artificial politeness. The faintest sneer tugged at the corners of his lips, but it was enough. The thinly veiled condescension was palpable. Malcolm took a deep breath, letting the air fill his lungs as he focused on keeping his composure. He could feel his hands tightening around the coffee cup, but he didn't say anything. He wouldn't give the man the satisfaction of a reaction, he knew better. But as Mr. Willoughby exited the diner, leaving the door to swing shut behind him, Malcolm's heart pounded in his chest. He hated it. The feeling of being reduced, of being dismissed by someone who had no idea who he was or what he had accomplished. He hated the reminder that no matter how far he had come, there would always be people who saw him as less than a doctor, less than a man of power. It was a constant battle, one that never seemed to stop. No matter how high he climbed, the same biases followed him. Those invisible walls that always seemed to appear just when he thought he had made it. Linda approached with his check, her hands trembling slightly as she set it down. She didn't speak, and neither did Malcolm. There was no need to. Words wouldn't fix what had just happened. It wasn't about the coffee or the food. It was about something far deeper than that. He reached into his wallet and paid, leaving a generous tip he always did, even when he felt the sting of the unspoken assumptions. Malcolm stood up from the booth, adjusting the strap of his briefcase as he walked toward the door. He paused for a moment, looking back at Linda. Her eyes were soft, almost apologetic. But she said nothing. It wasn't her fault. It was just the way the world worked. As he stepped out into the rain, he felt the cool droplets hit his skin, refreshing but not enough to wash away the feeling that lingered in the pit of his stomach. The city outside was full of noise, full of people with their own struggles, their own battles, and yet, there he was, a man who had fought tooth and nail to get to this place, still haunted by the same biases that had once tried to keep him down. As he walked toward his car, a part of him wondered just how long he would have to keep fighting. The world outside was changing, slowly, but it was still a place where men like him had to prove their worth over and over again. And it didn't seem like it was going to stop anytime soon. Malcolm's hands gripped the steering wheel as he navigated through the rain-slicked streets of Elmsford. The tension in his chest hadn't loosened since he left the diner. It had only worsened. His phone had buzzed twice in the past half hour, both times from his assistant, urging him to call. He had ignored them both. Tonight, he wasn't the renowned surgeon or the respected CEO. He was just a man, trying to breathe in a world that constantly took his breath away. He pulled up to the entrance of the courthouse, his headlights sweeping across the aging stone structure. The place was packed. Protesters were gathered at the steps, chanting loudly, waving signs demanding justice for yet another case of racial profiling in Elmsford. As much as he wanted to walk away, as much as he tried to keep his life away from the front lines, Malcolm knew this was inevitable. There were always protests, always marches, but this one felt different. The chants weren't just about one isolated incident. They were about a system, about an idea that stretched its roots far deeper than any one case. He shut off the engine and sat still for a moment. Outside, the noise from the protesters filled the air. He thought about the years he had spent carefully constructing his life, becoming the man everyone wanted to respect. But today, the system was reminding him, no matter how many degrees he had, no matter how much wealth he had accumulated, the world still saw him through the lens of race. And that could not be ignored. The sharp rapping on his window broke his reverie. He looked over to find Officer Mitchell, a man he had known for years but had never quite trusted. He was tall, his face lined with the exhaustion of someone who had seen too many injustices and was no longer sure where to stand. Still, he was one of the few officers who had shown Malcolm any kindness over the years, even if it was just a nod of acknowledgement in passing. "Dr. Ellis," Mitchell greeted him, his tone clipped but not unfriendly. "I've got a bit of a situation here. We're about to start the arraignment for Marcus Carter, another case of wrongful arrest and police brutality. You've got an interest in this, right?" Malcolm's chest tightened. He knew about Marcus Carter. He had seen the video circulating online. Another black man, falsely accused of a crime, treated with contempt by law enforcement. He had been planning to attend the arraignment in solidarity, to lend his voice to the growing chorus of calls for accountability. But now, with Mitchell's urgency hanging in the air, something told Malcolm that this wasn't just about standing with Marcus. "Yeah," Malcolm answered, his voice calm but carrying an edge that betrayed his anxiety. "I'm here for the hearing. What's going on?" Mitchell hesitated, his eyes flickering toward the courthouse entrance. "There's been some unexpected developments. Word is, someone at the station tipped off the press. Things could get out of hand today. They're expecting protesters to escalate, especially with the way this case is drawing attention. And, I think some of your friends might be involved." Malcolm's brow furrowed. He didn't have many friends in law enforcement, but the officers he did know were usually trustworthy. Mitchell was a mixed bag, sometimes friendly, other times distant. But Malcolm could sense the unease in his voice. "You think they'll try to stir up trouble?" Malcolm asked. He was already thinking ahead, strategizing. He had a name to protect now, his own, yes, but also the names of the people he had fought for. He had built an empire, not just to earn a living, but to create a space where he could do more good. But no matter how many walls he built, there was always someone ready to tear them down. "Could be," Mitchell said quietly. "And listen, I don't know if this is the right time, but..." He paused, then glanced over his shoulder as though making sure no one was listening. "There's been talk about the district attorney pushing for a harsher sentence. People are worried this case is going to turn into something bigger than what it is. And well, with the pressure from the higher-ups, there might be some moves to make an example out of you if you get too involved. You've been vocal, Dr. Ellis, too vocal. The warning hit Malcolm like a punch to the gut. He had been vocal. He knew it, and he had expected consequences, but he hadn't thought they would come like this. Still, he didn't let the frustration show on his face. He had always handled conflict with grace and intellect, not emotion. And this time, he wasn't going to let anyone use his words against him. "I appreciate the heads up, Mitchell," Malcolm said coolly. "But I'm not backing down." The tension between them was thick for a moment, as though Mitchell was waiting for Malcolm to reconsider. Finally, the officer gave a short nod, his lips tight. "I get it. Just keep your head down. I don't think they'll go after you directly, but you never know. Things are tense right now." Malcolm's mind raced. The media had already latched onto his name in connection with the case. There had been stories about his public support for victims of systemic violence, about his push for reform within the medical field. But this was different. This was personal. This wasn't just about the media, it was about the city. And it was about time he stopped sitting on the sidelines. "I'm going in," Malcolm said, his voice firm. "And if they want to make an example out of me, so be it. I'll give them something they won't forget." Mitchell opened his mouth, probably to say something more cautionary, but before he could, a sudden commotion erupted near the courthouse doors. The crowd of protesters outside had grown louder, more passionate, as they moved closer to the entrance. Malcolm looked up to see a handful of officers stepping forward, their uniforms making a sharp contrast against the waves of demonstrators. In that instant, he realized what had been building all day. The conflict was escalating, and there was no way to stop it now. Malcolm pushed the door open and stepped out into the rain, feeling the cold mist against his skin. He adjusted his coat, pulling it tighter around himself as he joined the sea of people now gathering at the front of the courthouse. A few people turned their heads as he walked through, their eyes scanning him for a moment before quickly looking away. They knew who he was, but in a crowd this large, in a place this tense, the distinctions between one man and another didn't matter as much. "Dr. Ellis!" a voice shouted through the chaos. Malcolm turned to see a woman in her late 30s, standing near the front of the crowd, a clipboard in hand. She was wearing a protest t-shirt, her eyes fierce with determination. "We've been waiting for you." Malcolm nodded, but didn't say anything. He wasn't one for speeches, not unless they were going to make a difference. As he approached the woman, he recognized her as one of the organizers from the rally. He had spoken to her before. Her name was Jade, and her passion for social justice was as intense as his own. "Are you ready for this?" she asked, her voice low but urgent. Malcolm hesitated for just a beat, looking at the protesters now shouting in unison, their chants echoing against the courthouse walls. They had gathered for justice, for accountability, but now it seemed as if that goal was slipping through their fingers. "Let's make sure they hear us," Malcolm said finally, his voice filled with determination. His mind raced with the awareness that the stakes had just gotten higher. There was no turning back. If he was going to do this, he would have to risk everything. Just as he was about to step forward, the doors of the courthouse swung open, and two officers emerged, standing in front of the crowd with arms crossed. One of them, Officer Daniels, was a familiar face. A man who had shown Malcolm nothing but disdain in their past encounters. His eyes locked with Malcolm's, a thin smile curling at the corners of his mouth. "Dr. Ellis," Daniel said with a sneer, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "I didn't expect to see you here. You planning on causing a scene?" The words stung, but Malcolm kept his composure. Daniels was the last person he needed to deal with right now. Still, his next words came out with a cold precision that he knew would make the officer think twice. "You might want to step aside, officer," Malcolm said, his gaze unwavering. "This isn't just a protest anymore, this is about justice." Daniel's smile only deepened, but there was something else in his eyes now. Something that told Malcolm the game had just changed. The crowd behind them began to chant louder, their voices rising above the tension that filled the space. The moment had arrived. Everything Malcolm had worked for, everything he had built, was now on the line. The air outside the courthouse was charged with a palpable tension, the crowd pushing forward as a line of officers stood firm in their uniforms. Arms crossed, Malcolm had seen protests before. He had participated in them, even organized them during his younger years. But nothing like this. The sheer weight of the moment felt different, heavier, as if the entire city was holding its breath, waiting for a match to light the powder keg of frustration and injustice. Malcolm stood at the front of the crowd, his posture straight, his eyes fixed on the officers blocking the entrance. They were outnumbered, but they didn't move, as though daring the crowd to make the first move. His heart pounded in his chest, but he focused on his breathing, willing himself to remain calm. "You ready?" Jade asked, her voice barely audible over the noise. Her eyes were wide, filled with both hope and fear. There were too many emotions running through the crowd, too many people who had been hurt and betrayed by a system that refused to acknowledge their pain. Malcolm nodded, but his thoughts were far from the words of encouragement he wanted to offer. The weight of his past, of all the times he had fought for something that had slipped through his fingers, weighed on him now. But there was no turning back. "I'm ready," he said finally, his voice steady, though the internal conflict still gnawed at him. Every part of him wanted to walk away, to let someone else take up the mantle. But it wasn't just about this moment, this protest, or even this case. It was about something far deeper. The system that refused to see him as anything more than a threat. The system that kept him and others like him down. "We need to push," Jade said, stepping forward, rallying the crowd. "We need to make sure they hear us." As she spoke, Malcolm's eyes flickered to the entrance where the doors had opened again. The figure of Officer Daniels appeared, flanked by 2 more officers. Daniels' eyes met his, and for a brief second, they stared at each other with an intensity that went beyond just the moment. Malcolm could see the contempt in Daniels' expression, the unspoken judgment, the belief that men like him had no place leading a charge like this. "Dr. Ellis," Daniels called, his voice cutting through the noise, his tone dripping with condescension. "You've made your point. This isn't the time for theatrics. Go home." Malcolm felt his pulse quicken. He had been preparing for this moment, but nothing could quite prepare him for the disdain that flooded Daniels' voice. "I'm not going anywhere, officer," Malcolm replied, his voice steady, his body poised. He knew this was the moment. The choice to stand, or to walk away and accept the silent acquiescence of a world that never treated him as an equal. Daniels took a step forward, his expression darkening. "I said, go home." "Is that a suggestion?" Malcolm shot back, his tone cold but controlled. The crowd's energy shifted, murmurs of uncertainty running through the protesters as they sensed the growing tension between the 2 men. But Malcolm knew this wasn't just about him anymore. He was no longer standing alone, even if it felt like it at times. The voices of the people, their chants, their frustrations, they were louder than any one man's fear. "Why don't you step aside, officer?" Malcolm said, his voice rising just enough for the crowd to hear. "If you want to stop me, you'll have to do more than talk." The words hung in the air for a beat, and for a moment, nothing happened. The crowd was silent, unsure whether to cheer or retreat. Daniel's lip curled into a sneer. "You think you're above this, don't you? Above all of us, above the law. You're just like the rest of them, trying to play hero, trying to make a name for yourself. This isn't your fight." That was when the first officer moved. Malcolm barely had time to react as one of the officers grabbed him by the arm. The officer was young, his uniform crisp and pressed, his stance rigid. There was no hesitation in the grip, but Malcolm knew it wasn't out of genuine intent to protect. It was about control. "Let go," Malcolm said, his voice low but firm. He could feel the anger bubbling beneath the surface, but he swallowed it, channeling everything he had learned over the years to keep his composure. This wasn't the time to lose his temper, not with so much on the line. He had already proven that he wasn't going to back down. Now he needed to show them just how far he was willing to go. "Do you know who I am?" he asked, his voice growing colder. "I'm Dr. Malcolm Ellis. I've saved more lives in a day than you could in a lifetime. And you're going to pull me off this ground like I'm some criminal? I don't think so." The officer hesitated, his fingers loosening slightly, but just as quickly, Daniels stepped in, his eyes glinting with something more than just disdain. There was a sick satisfaction in the way he spoke next. "You're nothing, Dr. Ellis," You're just another man trying to play above his station. Daniels sneered, his words deliberately cutting. You think just because you've got some fancy degrees and a nice title, you're above the law. You're the one who's going to be dragged through the mud today. And this time, no one will come to save you. Malcolm could feel the sting of Daniels' words like a slap to the face, but he remained still, every muscle in his body resisting the urge to react with anything less than grace. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on him now, watching, waiting to see if he would break. Instead, he drew in a deep breath, straightened his shoulders, and looked Daniels dead in the eyes. You want to see what happens when a man finally decides he's had enough? Malcolm's voice was quiet but steely. You'll find out soon enough. Before Daniels could respond, a shout rang out from the crowd behind them. Let him go! Someone yelled. A voice Malcolm didn't recognize, but knew was filled with defiance. The chant grew louder, spreading like wildfire as the protesters rallied around him. For a brief moment, the officers seemed to hesitate. They were outnumbered now, the protesters encroaching, chanting, not backing down. Daniels' face hardened, his jaw clenched, but the realization was evident in his eyes. He wasn't going to be able to force Malcolm to do anything. Not today. Malcolm took a step back, not out of fear, but out of necessity. He could see the storm building on the horizon. The crowd was restless, the anger simmering just below the surface. This wasn't just about Marcus Carter. This wasn't just about one arrest, one miscarriage of justice. This was about an entire system that refused to see the value in people like him, people who had fought and earned their place, only to be told, time and again, that they weren't enough. Malcolm could feel the pull of the moment, the weight of it sinking into him, reminding him why he had made the decision to come here in the first place. The system had to change, and if it took a public fight, if it took him standing at the edge of this battle, so be it. But as the officers shifted, as they began to close in around him, he realized that this was only the beginning. The true battle was still ahead. Step aside, Malcolm said, more forcefully now, his voice carrying through the crowd. This isn't over, not by a long shot. The officer holding him let go entirely, stepping back at his command, but only for a moment. The scene was about to explode, and there was no going back. Malcolm took a deep breath, gathering himself for what was to come. This wasn't just about Marcus. This was about the future, and if he was going to win, he had to push past the system, past the biases that had kept him in check, and finally, truly, make them see him for who he was. The crowd around Malcolm had grown, a sea of voices rising like a wave, their chants growing louder with each passing second. There was no turning back now. He could feel the palpable tension in the air as the police officers tightened their grip on the situation, clearly preparing to escalate matters further. Malcolm stood in the front, his back straight, his heart pounding, as he stared directly at Officer Daniels, who was standing a few feet away, glaring back at him. The two men were locked in an invisible battle, each one determined to prove their point. The anger in Daniels' eyes was evident. He had no intention of letting a man like Malcolm challenge his authority. But Malcolm wasn't about to let him get away with it. Not anymore. Step aside, officer, Malcolm said again, his voice calm but firm. The words carried across the crowd, the tension in the air palpable, as everyone waited to see how the situation would unfold. Daniel's lip curled in disdain. You really think you're above this, don't you? He sneered. You think your fancy degrees and your title give you the right to stand in front of me, telling me what to do? This isn't your world, Dr. Ellis. This is the real world, and in the real world, people like you don't get to make the rules. The words stung, more than Malcolm cared to admit. There it was again, the assumption that his success, his position in life, was just a fluke, that somehow, he didn't belong in this fight, that he wasn't worthy of standing up for justice. But Malcolm wasn't about to let Daniels dictate the terms of this confrontation. He had worked his entire life to get to this point, to prove that he was more than what people assumed of him based on his race. He wasn't just a surgeon, a CEO, or a figurehead in a system that constantly overlooked people like him. He was a man who had earned his place through hard work and determination, and he wasn't about to let anyone strip that away from him. You don't get to define who I am, Daniels, Malcolm said, his voice steady, unwavering. You don't get to tell me where I belong or what I'm capable of. This isn't just about me, and it's not about you. This is about a system that has failed too many people, a system that continues to make excuses for its own corruption, and it's time for it to change. The words hung in the air, reverberating through the crowd. Malcolm could see a shift in the atmosphere, as if the very words had given the people around him the courage to speak up, to raise their voices in solidarity. They weren't just there for him anymore. They were there for themselves, for their own rights, for their own humanity. But Daniels wasn't done. The sneer on his face deepened, and he stepped closer, his tone growing more venomous. "You think you're some kind of hero? Don't you a savior to these people?" He waved his hand dismissively toward the protesters. "They don't need you. They don't need anyone like you, coming in here, trying to be their knight in shining armor. You're no different than the rest of them, and I'm tired of pretending otherwise." Malcolm's chest tightened, but he refused to let Daniels see the effect his words were having. This wasn't about fighting back in the way Daniels expected. This was about showing strength through something far greater: dignity. "You're right about one thing," Malcolm said, his voice low and controlled. "I'm not their savior, but I am their ally, and I'm not going anywhere." For a brief moment, silence fell between them, the crowd holding its breath, waiting for the next move. But before anything else could happen, Officer Daniels made his move. With a sudden, swift motion, he reached out, grabbing Malcolm's arm and yanking him forward. The force of it caught Malcolm off guard for just a second, but he quickly regained his footing, standing tall, despite the physical force used against him. The crowd around them erupted into shouts, some calling for the officers to let go, others shouting in frustration at the escalating violence. Malcolm's mind raced, but his body remained steady. He had trained for moments like this. As much as he wanted to lash out, to fight back against the injustice in front of him, he knew he had to stay calm. He had to think strategically. In one fluid motion, he used the officer's momentum against him. He pivoted, twisting his body just enough to free his arm from Daniels's grip. The action was swift, calculated, and as much as Daniels had tried to overpower him, Malcolm's training, his understanding of the power of composure, was his advantage. He stood firm, his eyes locked onto Daniels for a moment, the unspoken challenge hanging in the air. But Daniels was far from done. His face flushed with anger, his hands balled into fists at his sides. The crowd was growing louder now, the protesters rallying around Malcolm, shouting his name, shouting for justice. This wasn't just about him anymore, it was about everyone who had been silenced, everyone who had been ignored. "Enough!" Daniels shouted, his voice breaking through the chaos. "This is getting out of hand." Malcolm stood silently, his gaze never leaving Daniels. The officer was beginning to lose control, his mask of authority slipping, his true nature coming through. In that moment, it became clear to everyone around them who the real threat was. Daniels wasn't interested in justice. He was interested in maintaining the status quo. He was the embodiment of the system that had failed Malcolm and so many others, and he wasn't going to let anyone expose that. "I'm not afraid of you, Daniels," Malcolm said, his voice steady despite the rising tension. "And neither are they." The crowd responded with a roar, their voices rising in unity. Malcolm could feel the energy of the people around him, the strength in their collective voice. This was their fight too. It wasn't just one man standing against a corrupt system, it was an entire community, ready to demand their rights. Daniel's face twisted in anger as he took a step forward. "You want to see what happens when people like you defy the law?" he growled, his eyes flashing with something dangerous. He was no longer hiding his contempt, no longer pretending that he was the voice of reason. He was showing his true colors, an officer who had long since abandoned his duty to protect and serve. And then, it happened. Before anyone could stop him, Officer Daniels lunged forward, pushing Malcolm back. The force of it sent him stumbling, but he regained his balance quickly, his resolve only strengthening. The crowd gasped, the tension mounting to an unbearable level. This wasn't just an argument anymore. This was a confrontation that was quickly spiraling out of control. But as Daniels reached out again, this time to grab Malcolm, a voice rang out through the chaos. "Stop now!" The crowd went silent as a new figure emerged from the group of officers. Officer Mitchell, the one man who had shown Malcolm any semblance of respect. His expression was calm, but there was an undeniable firmness in his tone. He stepped between Malcolm and Daniels, his body blocking the officer's path. "Daniels, stop. This isn't how we handle things," Mitchell said, his voice carrying the weight of authority. For a moment, it seemed as though the entire scene had frozen. Daniels was seething, his fists clenched at his sides, his body trembling with the effort to keep his anger in check. But Mitchell stood firm, unwavering. And slowly, Daniels' rage seemed to dissipate. His shoulders slumped, and his jaw clenched. But he didn't move. Malcolm's heart was pounding in his chest, the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He was still standing, still fighting. But the moment was far from over. The uncertainty of what would come next hung in the air. The tension between the two officers, a reminder of the fractured system, they were all fighting to change. Not today, Malcolm muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible over the chaos. Not today. The crowd began to stir again, sensing that the moment of confrontation had passed, but the stakes had never been higher. This was just the beginning. The system might have tried to break him, but it hadn't succeeded yet. But as the voices of the protesters began to rise once again, Malcolm knew that the real fight was just beginning. This wasn't just about the confrontation with Officer Daniels. This was about something bigger, something that would take everything he had to change. The air around Malcolm crackled with an intensity that was impossible to ignore. The chants of the protesters had reached a fever pitch, their collective voice a growing wave of defiance against the systemic injustices they had endured for so long. But it wasn't just the crowd that was building. The tension between Malcolm and Officer Daniels was reaching its boiling point, each moment more charged than the last. Malcolm's heart pounded in his chest, but his body remained steady. His mind was clear, focused. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, the years of silent battles leading up to this one. This was the moment he had to prove that the system could no longer break people like him, that the status quo had to change. He squared his shoulders, standing tall despite the chaos unfolding around him. Officer Daniels, on the other hand, seemed to relish the confrontation. His face was twisted with contempt, his eyes sharp with the unmistakable glint of malice. The officer took a step forward, pushing through the crowd of protesters who had begun to form a protective barrier around Malcolm. "You really think you can walk in here and change things, huh?" Daniels spat, his voice laced with venom. "You're nothing but a puppet, Dr. Ellis, a token in a world that doesn't care about your cause. You want to be some hero. Well, this is where the story ends." Malcolm's jaw tightened, but he stood his ground, his gaze unwavering. The words felt like a slap, but they didn't land. The way Daniels expected, Malcolm wasn't a token, he wasn't anyone's tool. He had earned every inch of his success and every moment of his fight for justice. This was his moment to show Daniels, and everyone watching, that he wouldn't back down. "No," Malcolm said, his voice calm but laced with steel. "This is where your story ends, officer. You've spent your career pretending to uphold justice, but all you've ever done is protect the corruption that thrives in this city, and it's time for that to stop." Daniels took another step forward, his breath coming faster now, his anger growing palpable. "You don't know anything about me. You think your degrees and your high-rise offices mean something to me. They don't. You're just a man trying to act above it all, trying to tell us how to live, but you won't last, Dr. Ellis people, like you never do." The anger in Daniel's voice was almost a tangible thing, a threat hanging in the air between them. The crowd around them had fallen into a tense silence, all eyes fixed on the showdown unfolding before them. Malcolm's mind raced, calculating his next move. He wasn't about to let Daniels rile him into a rash decision. This wasn't a fight of fists or power, it was a fight for the truth, for justice. And if he was going to win, it had to be on his terms. "People like me?" Malcolm echoed, his voice sharp now. "What does that even mean, Daniels? Because I'm black, because I've succeeded where you thought I couldn't. Let me make something clear. I'm not some exception to the rule. I'm proof that people like me can change the world, and I'm not backing down." The words stung Daniels more than Malcolm had expected. He could see the flicker of doubt in the officer's eyes, the way his posture shifted, as though trying to shake off the weight of Malcolm's words. But Daniels wasn't about to let go of the power he thought he had. "You're a fool," Daniels muttered under his breath, stepping closer. His face was inches from Malcolm's now, their breath mingling in the cold air, the tension so thick it could have been sliced with a knife. Malcolm didn't flinch. Instead, he stood tall, staring directly into Daniel's eyes. "I know what you're afraid of," he said quietly. You're afraid of change. You're afraid that the system you've built your life on is crumbling, and you're too scared to do anything about it. Well, here's the truth. It's already changed, and it's only going to keep changing. There was a long beat of silence as they locked eyes, the world around them holding its breath. The crowd had gone still, waiting for the next move. Malcolm could feel his pulse in his ears, the urgency of the moment. He had never felt more alive, more resolute in his purpose. Daniel's expression faltered, his grip on his anger slipping for a moment. And in that fleeting moment, Malcolm saw something he hadn't expected: a crack in the officer's armor. Daniels wasn't just angry, he was terrified. Terrified of being exposed, terrified of losing control. He had spent his career perpetuating a system that marginalized and punished people like Malcolm. And now, that system was on the brink of collapse. "You think this is about you?" Daniel spat, his eyes wide with fury. "You're just another cog in the machine, Dr. Ellis. You'll never get the change you're looking for. I've seen people like you fail before, and I'll watch you fail again." That was when it happened. In the blink of an eye, Daniels lunged forward, his hands reaching for Malcolm. The aggression was swift, calculated. He was no longer trying to intimidate, but to silence. But this time, Malcolm was ready. He wasn't going to be dragged down by someone like Daniels. Not today. With a smooth, practiced movement, Malcolm stepped to the side, using Daniel's momentum against him. The officer's hands grasped empty air as he stumbled forward, thrown off balance. Malcolm turned, using the brief moment to regain control of the situation. He stepped in front of Daniels, blocking his path, his stance wide and firm. "Not today, Daniels," Malcolm said, his voice steady, unwavering. "You don't control this fight." Daniels recovered quickly, but the shock of the failed attempt was evident in his eyes. He was angry, furious at being outmaneuvered, and his frustration mounted with each passing second. But there was no turning back now. The crowd, sensing that the power had shifted, erupted in a wave of support, their voices rising in a chorus of defiance. Malcolm wasn't just fighting for his own future anymore. He was fighting for everyone who had ever been oppressed by this system. "Step aside," Daniels growled, his fists clenched. "This is your last warning, Dr. Ellis." But Malcolm stood tall, unwavering. He could see the way Daniels was trembling now, the way his composure was slipping. The officer was no longer in control. He was flailing, his words hollow, his intentions exposed. He wasn't the enforcer of the law, he was a man afraid of losing his grip on power. "I've been warned my whole life," Malcolm said, his voice ringing out over the growing chants of the crowd. "Warned that I didn't belong, warned that I couldn't change anything, but here I am, and I'm not going anywhere." Malcolm could feel the resolve building inside him, the strength of his purpose becoming a force greater than anything Daniels could throw at him. He wasn't going to be silenced. Not today. Not ever again. In that moment, Officer Daniels' true nature was laid bare. His anger, his fear, it all came spilling out. The man who had spent his career upholding a system of control was now the one losing control. His mask had cracked, and the truth of who he was, and who he had been all along, was exposed for everyone to see. "You think you've won?" Daniels sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "You're a fool if you think this is over. The system will always win." Malcolm's eyes narrowed, but his voice was calm. "No, Daniels. The system is broken, and we're the ones who are going to fix it." The crowd erupted again, their voices a collective roar that reverberated through the courtyard. Malcolm knew that he had won. This wasn't just about one officer or one protest, it was about the future. It was about changing the system, brick by brick, voice by voice. And it had started here, today. But as the officers began to move toward him, their intentions unclear, Malcolm knew this was far from over. The stakes had just reached a new height, and he wasn't sure what the next move would be. But whatever it was, he was ready. The moment hung in the air, unresolved, as the crowd surged forward with their chant, the sound drowning out everything else. The fight for justice was only just beginning, and Malcolm was standing at the forefront, unshaken and determined. The night after the confrontation was a blur. The streets outside the courthouse had quieted, but the echoes of the protest, the chanting, and the tension still reverberated through Malcolm's mind. As the crowd dispersed, with some heading home in exhaustion and others gathering in smaller groups to continue planning. The weight of what had happened settled over him. Malcolm stood in the middle of the street, the rain now tapering off into a light drizzle, his breath visible in the cool air. His heart was still racing from the adrenaline of the showdown with Officer Daniels. But there was something else lingering now. A strange calmness, an understanding that he had finally done something that mattered. But it wasn't over yet, not by a long shot. The officers had backed down, but the tension in the air hadn't dissipated. It had only shifted, transformed into something new. Daniels had been forced to retreat, but his retreat was not an admission of defeat. It was just the first crack in the wall. The real battle was still ahead. Malcolm had been ready to stand his ground, but the uncertainty of what would come next gnawed at him. What would the fallout be? How would Daniels and the system react? And how could he, one man, ensure that the change they had fought for wouldn't just fade into another footnote in the history of broken promises? As he walked away from the courthouse, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, his fingers trembling slightly as he saw the name on the screen. It was Mitchell. "Malcolm," Mitchell's voice came through, urgent but tinged with relief. "I don't know how you did it, but you really shook things up today, Daniels. He's not getting away with it, he's being pulled in for questioning tomorrow. Word's already spread that there's going to be an internal investigation into his conduct." Malcolm stopped in his tracks, a rush of emotion flooding through him. There was victory in Mitchell's words, but it wasn't complete. The battle was far from over. There were still questions, still systemic issues that hadn't been addressed, still officers who believed they were above reproach. "But it's not just Daniels," Mitchell continued. "The higher-ups are talking about an overhaul of some of the internal protocols. There's real momentum now. People are talking about reform, actual reform, Malcolm. It's happening." Malcolm's chest tightened, a mixture of disbelief and cautious hope. This was what he had been fighting for, wasn't it? This was the beginning of something much bigger than a single protest, bigger than any one officer. This could be the first step toward dismantling the system that had allowed people like Daniels to thrive without fear of accountability. He looked around, the empty streets now carrying a sense of finality. "Is it enough, Mitchell?" he asked quietly, his voice filled with uncertainty. "Is it enough to really change things?" Mitchell was silent for a moment. "We'll see," he said finally, a hint of caution in his tone. "But it's a start, and with everything that's happened, with the attention on this case, we might finally be able to do something. We might finally be able to make this system see what it's been doing." Malcolm nodded, even though Mitchell couldn't see it. "I'm in," he said, his resolve solidifying. "I'm not going to stop until we do this right, until we change it all." The next day, the fallout from the confrontation reverberated through Elmsford in ways no one could have predicted. Daniels was placed on administrative leave pending an investigation, and news outlets began covering the protest, the altercation, and the subsequent call for reform within the police department. The city was in a frenzy of discussion about systemic racism, corruption, and the need for police accountability. The media circus that followed the protest only intensified the attention on Malcolm's fight. But as the city buzzed with debate, Malcolm found himself once again in the quiet of his office, staring out at the skyline, lost in thought. His phone rang again, breaking his reverie. This time, it was Linda from the diner. "I've been hearing about what happened yesterday, Dr. Ellis," she said, her voice warm with a mixture of admiration and disbelief. "I just wanted to say, I'm proud of you. You're doing something important. Don't let anyone make you doubt that." Malcolm smiled at the kindness in her voice. "Thanks, Linda," he said, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the weather. "It's just the beginning." He hung up and sat back in his chair, considering the road ahead. He had fought for something bigger than himself, and it had made a difference, but there was still work to be done. He couldn't let the momentum die now. This was only the first step in a long battle for systemic change. Days turned into weeks, and the momentum for reform continued to build. The investigation into Daniels' conduct was just the start. Pressure from local activists, media outlets, and concerned citizens forced the city's leaders to confront the issues that had long been ignored. The police department's internal review processes were scrutinized more intensely than ever before, and whispers of police union corruption began to surface. Daniels, once untouchable, found himself the subject of a criminal investigation. Malcolm's role in all of this was undeniable. He had sparked something, a fire that would be hard to extinguish. His public stance had brought people together, united under a common cause for justice. But he knew the fight wasn't over. For every victory, there were more battles to fight. The structural changes required to truly reform the system wouldn't happen overnight. But the seeds had been planted. As he sat in his office one afternoon, sorting through paperwork, the door opened, and Mitchell walked in, his expression serious, but hopeful. "Things are looking up, Malcolm," he said, closing the door behind him. "There's talk of a community oversight board, independent from the police department, to ensure transparency in investigations. They're bringing in outside experts to help rework training protocols. It's not enough, but it's a start." Malcolm nodded, a quiet satisfaction settling in his chest. "We've got a long road ahead, but it's a road we're finally walking down." "Yeah," Mitchell agreed, taking a seat across from him. "But you've changed the game, man. You stood up when no one else would. You've given people hope, and that's something you can't take back." Malcolm's gaze drifted to the window, where the sun was beginning to set behind the city. He had come a long way from that small apartment in the city's outskirts. He had fought for this moment, for this change, and now, it was finally within reach. But the work wasn't done. Not yet. As he turned back to Mitchell, he smiled, though the weight of the future still lingered in his eyes. "This is just the beginning, and I'm not stopping now." A few months later, Malcolm stood in front of a packed auditorium, preparing for his keynote address at the city's first-ever summit on police reform. The air was charged with anticipation, the energy of a community that had risen up together to demand change. As he stepped to the podium, his eyes scanned the crowd. Faces he recognized from the protest, activists who had been with him from the start, and new faces, people who were now part of the movement, all gathered here because of what had been set in motion. He cleared his throat, his heart steady in his chest. The fight had taken its toll, but it had also fueled something inside him, a fire that he knew would never go out. "We've come a long way," he began, his voice filling the room. "And we've done something that many said we couldn't do. We've opened eyes, we've forced people to see the truth. But I'm not here to talk about what we've done, I'm here to talk about what we still have to do." The crowd listened intently, the weight of his words settling in the air. He had taken the first steps, but the road to real change was long. It always would be. "None of this would have been possible without all of you," Malcolm continued. "Without the people who stood up, who raised their voices, who refused to let the world stay as it was. But we can't stop now. We've changed the conversation. Now it's time to change the system." As the applause echoed through the room, Malcolm felt the surge of hope that had propelled him from the very beginning. He had taken a stand, and it had made a difference. The system was starting to change, bit by bit, and no matter how long the road ahead, he knew this was just the beginning. He had won this fight, but there were still more battles to come, and Malcolm was ready.